They said she was simply bathing, that he merely saw her. That desire flared between them in a single glance. But behind that story was something far more than an accident of sight. Historians defended the king. Artists painted her naked. But no one asked what she felt in the texts. She is the one who became David's wife. But before that, she was another man's wife, and her husband died under mysterious circumstances. That sin altered the history of Israel. That choice led to tragedy. But no one paid the price like she did. Her name is barely mentioned in the Psalms, yet it was her son who became the greatest king. This woman became both desire and disgrace, and the mother of the wisest. This is who she was. Bathsheba. Bathsheba lived in the quiet corners of Jerusalem, tucked behind limestone walls and patterned shadows, in a home built for waiting. Her world was shaped by the absence of her husband and the stillness of her routine. Each day followed the same rhythm: the grinding of grain in the morning, the folding of linens in the heat of midday, the careful measuring of oils and spices for the evening. The rooms she moved through were filled with light, but not joy light that poured in through narrow windows, tracing the edges of her solitude. Her life was not dramatic, nor loud, nor visible. It was structured, proper, and defined by what she was expected to be: obedient, faithful, patient. Uriah, her husband, belonged more to the battlefield than to her. He was a soldier in the king's army, one of the loyal men who followed orders without question, and spent more nights beneath the stars of foreign lands than under the roof of his own home. When he came back, he carried war with him, its discipline, its silences, its distance. He spoke sparingly, moved efficiently, and loved her more out of duty than intimacy. There were moments, brief and flickering, when tenderness passed between them, but they vanished as quickly as they came. Bathsheba had long stopped expecting warmth. She had learned instead to value the weight of a steady presence, even if it came only for a handful of days each season. But even those days had become rare. The king's campaigns had grown longer. The city's air was thick with the breath of strategy and bloodshed. And Bathsheba, like many women of Jerusalem, became a wife in name, a widow in practice, clinging to routines that anchored her in the absence. Her beauty, though undeniable, had become a quiet burden. The neighbors spoke of her in hushed admiration, not because she sought attention, but because she could not hide what the sun illuminated so clearly. Her features were soft yet sharp, framed by dark, cascading hair and eyes that carried depth, even when they revealed nothing. But Bathsheba neither flaunted nor played into what others saw. She kept her head low, her voice soft, and her life private. Beauty brought notice, and notice brought risk. She had no desire to be noticed. She only wanted to be safe, still, in the silences. In the late hours, when the lamps burned low and the outside world grew still, Bathsheba would lie awake with thoughts she dared not voice. She longed not for wealth or status, not for the privileges of court life, but for something unnameable, something that would make her feel like more than a shadow in someone else's story. The world of men revolved around war, kingship, and lineage. Women were vessels, supporters, keepers of the home and of memory. She had done her part. She had been faithful. She had been silent. And yet she remained on the edge of relevance. A figure half seen, always waiting. The weight of waiting changed a woman. It reshaped her from the inside out. Bathsheba had learned to hold her breath through absence, to suppress longing, to prepare herself for disappointments she would never be allowed to grieve. There were days she would stare out into the distance from her courtyard, watching the city shift and breathe, wondering if her name would ever mean something more than what it did now. Uriah's wife, a woman without children, a woman without story. But beneath that stillness, something else lived. It was not rebellion, it was not ambition. It was something older, quieter, forged by centuries of women whose lives were built on endurance. Bathsheba carried that inheritance in her bones. She did not rage, she endured. And in that endurance, she sharpened. Her mind was not idle, her heart was not numb. She absorbed everything: the behaviors of the palace from afar, the shifting dynamics of power, the names that passed through the streets, the way kings were spoken of in reverence and fear. She knew how fragile security was, how quickly favor could turn to ruin. She knew how women disappeared the moment their usefulness expired. So she stayed still, she stayed proper, she stayed invisible. No one saw her as a threat. No one saw her as anything more than a beautiful figure behind a gate. And that is exactly how they allowed the story to begin. Bathsheba did not know it yet, but history had already marked her. The king, the court, the scriptures, they would one day speak of her in fragments, in insinuations, in scandal and poetry. Her name would be bound forever to a moment not of her choosing. She would be remembered not for her silence, not for her loyalty, not for the long years of waiting, but for one evening, one gaze, one decision made by someone else. But before that moment, there was this: a woman unseen, faithful to a man who belonged more to war than to her, isolated within a world that measured her by beauty and fertility and silence. She had lived within the bounds of tradition. She had followed the rules, and she had found, as so many before her had, that obedience did not guarantee protection. The walls around her did not keep the world out. They only made it easier for the world to look in without truly seeing her. She was not yet a queen, not yet a scandal, not yet a mother, not yet a symbol. She was Bathsheba, the forgotten woman, the patient one, the quiet figure in the background of a city pulsing with power. And though no one knew it yet, her life would soon alter the course of kings. It began with water, not with words or glances or intention, but with the simple act of bathing, as she had done countless times before. The courtyard was quiet, surrounded by high walls that curved protectively around her private space. It was evening, the time designated by law and tradition for purification. The water was cool against her skin, carrying away the residue of the day, the dust, the weight of invisible expectations. She was not thinking of beauty. She was not thinking of eyes. She was thinking of ritual, of rhythm, of obedience. This was not indulgence, it was duty. But beyond those walls, from a height she could not see, another set of eyes was watching, uninvited, unannounced. The king stood above the city. From his terrace, where the rooftops stretched out like a map of lives, he could access, command, alter. It was spring, the time when kings went out to war. But this king had stayed behind, sending others to fight while he walked alone above the city. He saw her then. He saw the curve of her body, the way the fading sunlight touched her skin. And desire bloomed not, the kind that asks permission, but the kind that consumes and assumes. Bathsheba did not know she had been seen. She did not know messengers had already been sent. She did not hear the conversation that unfolded behind palace walls, the whispered inquiries, the instructions given with the authority of a man who always got what he wanted. What she knew was the knock at the door, the servants who bowed low and spoke not as friends, but as instruments of royal will. She was summoned, and summoning was not a request. It was a verdict. There was no time to prepare, no explanation. Only the long walk from her home to the palace, through corridors lined with stone and silence, through chambers echoing with footsteps and power. The air inside felt heavier than outside, perfumed and controlled, saturated with decisions made. Long before she arrived, she was led into his presence, not as a guest. She could not look away, but neither could she fully comprehend what was happening. This was the king, the anointed, the man after God's own heart, and yet his eyes held something not divine, not righteous. They held hunger. She felt it before he even spoke. The kind of hunger that does not consider consequence, the kind that views beauty not as blessing, but as entitlement. There were no witnesses, no defense. She did not scream. She did not run. She did what women had always done. She obeyed, because refusing was not an option. The world had not given her power, only place, and place was easily overturned when a man of power reached for more. When it was over, she was sent away. No ceremony, no words of comfort or guilt, just silence and the echo of footsteps as she returned home, marked by something she could not name. She did not cry. There were no tears, only stillness. Her body felt foreign, like something had been taken, but not entirely. Like her name no longer belonged to her alone. Like her future had been altered by someone else's desire. Days passed, then weeks, and then the turning began. The nausea, the tension, the change. She had known her body for years, and now it was different. It spoke to her in new rhythms. It held life. And with that life came truth she could not hide, could not explain without revealing everything. She sent word to the palace. She did not go herself. She did not plead. She simply named the fact. She was with child, and it was the king's. What happened next was not repentance, it was strategy. The king did not come to her. He did not acknowledge what had passed between them. Instead, he summoned her husband back from war. Uriah returned to Jerusalem, not to his wife, but to a political theater already unfolding. The king fed him, flattered him, ordered him to return home, but Uriah, in his loyalty, refused. How could he enjoy comfort while his comrades slept in tents? Bathsheba knew what the king was trying to do. She saw it in the pacing of servants, in the urgent whispers, in the way her door remained unopened. He wanted to mask the child, to rewrite the timeline, to assign fatherhood to another. But the plan failed. Uriah would not be manipulated. So the king escalated. He sent Uriah back to the front, bearing a sealed message the man would never read. Inside was an order. Place Uriah where the battle is fiercest, and withdraw. Let him fall. Let him be forgotten. Bathsheba never saw the letter, but she saw the soldiers who returned. She saw the absence that followed. She received the news as custom dictated, wrapped in formal condolences and thin gestures. Uriah was dead, a casualty of war, another name in the growing list of those who died serving their king. But she knew, not because they told her, but because Silence speaks loudest when it follows betrayal. She mourned publicly, as was expected, or her garments covered her head, sat in ash. But inside, her grief was not just for her husband, it was for herself, for the loss of safety, for the destruction of trust, for the unraveling of her life without warning, without justice, without voice. She had not chosen this path. It had been chosen for her. Desire, deceit, death, each layered one upon the other like stones on a grave. And beneath them she remained, alive but altered, carrying the life of a king who acted like a god. Bathsheba understood now that love was not part of this story. Only power, only survival. Only the slow, painful reckoning that comes when you realize the world does not protect women who are beautiful and obedient. It consumes them, and when it is finished, it buries the truth beneath silence and song. But she was not finished, not yet. The child inside her still grew, unaware of the web in which it had been conceived. And Bathsheba, the forgotten wife, the obedient subject, the reluctant guest of the palace, began to see clearly that she was alone in this. She would not be rescued. She would not be honored. She would not be loved. She would endure. And perhaps, in time, she would learn how to reclaim what had been taken. But first, she would survive. The palace was not built for grieving women. Its walls were too polished, too symmetrical, too preoccupied with appearances to make space for sorrow that could not be controlled. Bathsheba moved through its halls like a shadow, now no longer the wife of a soldier, but the wife of a king. But behind the change in title, behind the gilded fabrics and the silent servants, there was only absence, the kind that came not from distance, but from displacement. She had not been placed into this life. She had been folded into it, absorbed, rebranded, and made into something she did not recognize. The moment Uriah's name was erased, her identity became a quiet battlefield one. She had no choice but to navigate alone. Her body carried the weight of what had been done and what had been lost. The child growing within her had not asked for any of it, had not chosen this lineage or this story. It simply existed, a small spark of life nested in the wreckage of betrayal. Bathsheba placed her hands on her abdomen more than she spoke. She did not whisper to the unborn. She did not sing, but she listened to the silence, to the shifting of power in the court, to the way people spoke around her, not to her. They saw a queen-in-waiting, a future mother of royal blood. But they did not see the woman who had been claimed without consent, folded into palace lifelike, a relic pulled from someone else's ruin. The king did not visit often. When he did, it was ceremonial, brief, and stiff. His guilt lingered in the corners of the room like smoke that would not dissipate. He mourned Uriah, but only in the ways that were safe. He did not speak the man's name, did not recount the loyalty that had made his murder so calculated. Instead, he retreated into the layers of his office: king, judge, psalmist, father. Each role carefully curated to overwrite the one he had played the night he summoned Bathsheba to the palace. And she, now a figure in his story, had no choice but to wear the image he had crafted for her, the one who had become his wife, not the one who had been stolen. She tried not to resent the child, but resentment is not always loud. Sometimes it lives in the way a mother hesitates before touching her belly, in the way her eyes grow distant when others smile and speak of future kings, in the way she walks through marble halls with her head high while carrying a weight that was never meant to be hers. Bathsheba did not allow herself to fall apart. She knew there was no room for that. A broken woman was not useful. And here, in this place, usefulness was survival. She learned to read the palace like a second language. She watched the other wives, the concubines, the servants. She understood how alliances formed in silence, how power drifted from one corridor to another, depending on who had the king's attention that day. She knew that smiles could be weapons, that laughter could mean danger. She mastered the art of presence without invitation, of grace without safety. And slowly she taught herself how to exist inside a world that had consumed her without warning. But even careful survival has limits. When the child was born, there was no celebration, only tension. The baby, delicate and small, did not cry as loudly as he should have. His breath was shallow, his skin pale. Bathsheba held him with trembling arms, and for the first time in months, something broke inside her, not loudly, not visibly, but deep in the marrow of her bones. A tremor began. She had carried him through silence, through shame, through stolen nights and cold days. And now she saw in his tiny frame not a future king, but a fragile life already slipping away. The palace buzzed with whispers. Was this punishment, judgment? The king fasted, prayed, wept on the floor of his chamber. But Bathsheba did not fast. She did not plead. She had learned what prayers bought in this world: silence and consequences. She stayed by her son's side, holding his weightless body, willing him to stay, to fight, to defy the story that had been written around him. But he did not stay. He did not survive. When he died, the palace shifted again. The mourning was real, but orchestrated, folded into public image and royal dignity. Bathsheba mourned privately, fiercely, in the only way she could, by surviving it. She did not scream, she did not curse, she did not accuse. But inside her, the quiet grief crystallized into something harder than sorrow. Resolve. Her womb had been a battlefield. Her body a stage for decisions made by men with titles and robes. And now it was hers again. Hers to protect, to prepare, to reclaim. She would not be cast aside. She would not fade into the footnotes of royal scandal. She had endured too much to vanish. The people looked at her and saw fragility. They did not see the slow construction of strength beneath her skin. They did not see the plans that began to take root, the thoughts that unfurled in the quiet hours of the night. Bathsheba had lost a husband, a child, a name, but not her memory. And memory, when cultivated carefully, could become the blueprint for something enduring. She said little in those months, but she remembered everything: the faces, the whispers, the shifting alliances, the mistakes, the betrayals. And when her body began to change again, when new life stirred within her, she did not fear it, she did not resent it. This child would not carry the same curse. This child would be hers, and she would ensure that he would not be forgotten. Bathsheba was no longer simply a woman who had been taken. She was a woman who had survived being taken. She was not yet a queen in title, but in spirit, in silence, in calculation she had already begun to rule. Bathsheba learned early that power in the palace was not granted, it was studied, memorized, waited for, and seized quietly. After the death of her first child, something in her had changed permanently, not just in her body, which healed slowly, but in her spirit, which hardened with purpose. She understood now that mourning was not a shield, that pain was not protection. The palace walls would not guard her, and its people would not defend her. In their eyes, she had become a part of the king's household, another ornament in his crown, another chapter in his legend. But Bathsheba was not content with being remembered as a footnote in another man's story. She carried too much grief, too much awareness, and now she carried life again when her second pregnancy began. The court's silence was different. There was no whisper of judgment, no undertone of consequence. It was as though the death of her firstborn had erased the scandal of her arrival. People no longer called her the soldier's widow in hushed tones. Now they looked at her with shallow respect, laced with political calculation. She had endured loss under the roof of royalty, and that loss had cloaked her in a type of reluctant reverence. But Bathsheba did not mistake pity for power. She watched the way the king's other sons moved through the court with inherited confidence, the way they exchanged glances with advisors and jostled for proximity to the throne. She watched the way mothers of those sons whispered in corridors, arranged meetings, paid visits to generals and prophets. They were not waiting for permission, they were preparing futures. Bathsheba observed it all with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to gain. Her grief had given her invisibility, her survival had given her time, and now, with this new child growing inside her, she began to see not only what could be taken, but what could be secured. The plan was not formed all at once. It began in fragments, the way the king looked at her now, with a quiet gentleness he had never offered before, in the way he listened when she spoke softly about the needs of the household or the moods of his officials. He had lost a child with her, and now carried the guilt of that loss like a second skin. Bathsheba never punished him for it. She did not need to. Guilt was more pliable than anger, and guilt, she realized, could be molded. David aged quickly in those years. The wars that once made him glorious had begun to haunt his body. His face grew lined, his posture heavier, his voice more uncertain in private chambers. He clung to the vestiges of his strength in public, but Bathsheba saw what others missed. She saw the fatigue in his hands, the hesitation in his steps, and she knew that a time would come soon when his voice would no longer carry the final word. Others would step in, sons, advisors, prophets, and when that day came, someone would rise. The question was, who? Bathsheba's child had not yet been born, but she already felt the weight of his future pressing against her spine. She spoke to no one of her thoughts. She made no demands. She simply ensured that she remained close to the king, that she stayed visible, indispensable. She asked questions that positioned her as thoughtful. She made suggestions that made the king feel wise. She soothed his fears, not by challenging them, but by acknowledging them with quiet support. It was not manipulation. It was strategy born of survival. She had once been a woman with no voice. She would never be voiceless again. As the child grew within her, she prepared the space around him, not just in the chamber where he would sleep, not just in the linens and oils and herbs she requested from the midwives, but in the court itself. She kept track of who visited whom, who remained loyal to which sons, who might be swayed. She learned the names of priests and soldiers, scribes and elders. She asked about their families, their fears, their loyalties, and most importantly, she made sure the prophet Nathan did not forget her. Nathan had been a voice of conscience in the palace. He had condemned David once, standing against the king's abuse of power. Bathsheba respected him not just for his courage, but for his influence. He spoke, and people listened. And while she did not confide in him, she ensured he remembered her presence, her grief, her faith, and her son. She knew that when the time came, he would not be silent. The birth of Solomon was not grand, it was not public. It happened behind closed doors, as most royal moments did, veiled in secrecy and controlled presentation. The child came screaming into the world, full of life and strength, and Bathsheba held him with both love and purpose. She named him not only with her voice, but with her mind, Solomon, peace, but also strategy. He would be her legacy. He would be her justice. He would be the answer to every silence that had suffocated her. She did not beg the king to favor him. She let Solomon grow in the quiet glow of the king's presence, letting affection take root naturally. David was drawn to the boy. Perhaps it was the memory of the first son lost. Or perhaps it was something deeper, divine nudge, a guilt-born affection, a spiritual instinct. Whatever it was, Bathsheba nurtured it carefully. She never pushed, she never demanded. But when the king looked to her son with love, she placed her hand gently on his shoulder and let him feel that this child was different. Years passed, other sons grew bolder, louder. They staged parties, built alliances, whispered of inheritance. Bathsheba remained still, but never passive. She listened, she remembered, she gathered, and in the quiet hours of the night, she rehearsed what she would say when the moment came. She would not weep again for a child lost. She would not watch another woman's son claim what her own deserved. The plan was never a single moment. It was the layering of years, of patience, of presence. It was the careful assembly of a future that no one would see coming until it had already begun. Bathsheba had once been summoned without consent, touched without permission, left to carry shame alone. But now she moved through the palace, not as a woman taken, but as a woman who had taken back control. The king aged further. The throne stood unsteady, and Bathsheba stood ready. Her son would not be erased. Her voice would not be silenced. The time would come. And when it did, they would all see what had been building in silence. Not rebellion, not vengeance. Something more enduring. A legacy. The halls of the palace were colder now. Not because of the season, but because of time. Because age had crept into the bones of the kingdom and the body of its king. David, once a warrior, whose very presence commanded armies and quieted nations, had grown frail. His voice, once like thunder across battlefields, had softened to a whisper carried only by those standing close. His hands trembled, and his skin, once bronzed by sun and strength, now bore the translucence of a man fading from the world. Advisors came and went more frequently now. Sons, servants, generals, prophets all, orbiting the throne with increasing urgency, their eyes not on David's health, but on what would follow when that breathless silence finally arrived. Bathsheba watched all of this from a distance, though never far. She had long known that her power would not come in the noise of palace affairs, but in the moments others ignored. She had learned how to move without causing ripples, how to listen without drawing attention, how to speak only when it counted. Her son Solomon was no longer a child. He had grown beneath the king's eye, loved gently, yet never publicly named the heir. There had been soft promises, private affirmations, but no decree, and Bathsheba knew too well that in this place silence was a kind of danger, and hesitation a kind of death. Royal blood did not protect it, provoked, and legacy was only as real as the alliances that guarded it. In the outer courts, one of David's eldest remaining sons, had begun to move with purpose. He had the look of a king, the confidence of birthright, and the support of powerful men who preferred predictability to prophecy. Bathsheba heard his name whispered more often now. She saw the subtle shifts, guests dining later than usual, gifts being exchanged in hallways, foreign messengers avoiding her wing of the palace. It was not spoken openly, but the campaign had begun. Adonijah was building a throne beneath David's failing shadow, and the king, distant and wrapped in layers of blankets and memory, did not see. Etor chose not to. When news came to her that Adonijah had declared himself king at Enrogel, Bathsheba was not surprised. He had assembled chariots, thrown a feast, invited officials and brothers, and excluded only two, Nathan the prophet and Solomon. That exclusion was a message. It was not oversight, it was intent, and it meant that time had run out. The plan she had held in her chest for years could no longer wait. She did not panic. She prepared. Every moment of loss, every hour of silence, every whispered strategy returned to her now, like a weapon retrieved from its hiding place. She went to Nathan first. She had not forgotten him, and he, too, had not forgotten her nor the truth of what had happened so many years ago. Nathan understood what Adonijah's actions meant, not just politically, but spiritually. He knew the promises David had made to Bathsheba, the whispered commitment that her son would rule. But the promise was not written, and unwritten promises die in the mouths of dying kings. Together they moved. Bathsheba entered the king's chamber, not as a weeping wife or a grieving mother, but as a woman whose moment had come. David lay wrapped in furs, his face pale and drawn, his body more shadow than flesh, but his eyes, though dimmed, still held memory. She reminded him of his vow, not with desperation, but with precision. She laid before him the betrayal, not only of her, but of his own word. She did not accuse, she revealed, and in that moment the truth returned to David's face with the weight of memory and the sting of regret. Then Nathan followed, affirming her words, adding the voice of the prophet to the voice of the woman, the divine to the personal. It was not a rebellion they faced, it was a quiet coup already unfolding beyond the walls, and only David's word, spoken aloud and sealed with urgency, could stop it. He summoned those still loyal, and with trembling hands and a whisper of authority, he gave the command. Solomon would be king. He would ride on the king's own mule, be anointed by the prophet, and declared before the people while David yet lived. It would not be delayed. As the horns sounded and the people cried out, the city shifted beneath its own weight. Adonijah's feast turned to fear. His guests, once confident, scattered, and Bathsheba stood not in triumph, but in quiet awe. The years of silence, the decades of being reduced to a scandal, had brought her to this moment, not as a symbol of shame, but as the mother of a king. She had not begged for the crown. She had ensured it through patience, through strategy, through endurance. Solomon was crowned that day, not just with oil and cheers, but with the invisible strength of a mother's long-hidden battle. The court now spoke his name with reverence. Bathsheba's rooms grew busier, servants bowed lower, and the eyes that once looked past her now paused, knowing that this woman once taken without consent, once sidelined and silenced, had become the Queen Mother. But she did not celebrate loudly. She did not forget what it cost. She had carried betrayal in her body. She had buried a child birthed in scandal. She had survived a palace that praised beauty but feared female strength. Her son now sat on the throne, but her story was not just about his crown. It was about the long walk to this point, one quiet decision at a time. Through loss, through danger, through restraint, Bathsheba had waited in silence long enough. Now her name would be remembered, not as a footnote, but as the force behind a king, not as a victim, but as a woman who knew when to speak, and when she did, rewrote the future. The name Bathsheba would never be uttered in the same way again, not after the son she bore was anointed before the nation, not after the horns sounded through the city and Solomon was seated on the throne once promised in silence. She had entered the palace years ago with no power, no allies, no plan other than survival. But now she stood not only as Queen Mother, but as the quiet architect of a dynasty. Her hands, once trembling with grief and restraint, now rested upon the future of Israel itself. And yet she did not revel in glory. She did not bask in victory. For Bathsheba, triumph had never been a celebration. It was endurance vindicated. The palace that once threatened to erase her now revolved around her. Her chambers, once peripheral, became central. Her opinions, once ignored, now carried weight. Advisors who once overlooked her now watched for her approval. And Solomon, the boy born of ashes and silence, now ruled with her voice etched into his memory. She had not raised him to be powerful. She had raised him to be wise, because she knew better than anyone that thrones could be taken, voices could be stolen, and legacies could be rewritten if not guarded with vigilance. As the years passed, Bathsheba remained more than a symbol. She became a strategist, a counselor, a living testament to what happens when a woman refuses to disappear. She did not seek public attention, but her presence was felt in every policy, in every alliance, in every appointment made with long-term vision. When Solomon faced threats to his rule, it was Bathsheba who reminded him of the dangers of flattery and the seduction of unchecked ambition. She knew the difference between image and influence. She had survived a kingdom where both could kill. Her past, once spoken in whispers, the woman who bathed, the wife of Uriah, the king's temptation, was slowly reshaped, not through denial, but through presence. She did not erase her origin story. She transformed it. People remembered not only how she had come to the palace, but what she had become within it. She had once been summoned like an object. Now she summoned kings. Even the scriptures, which so often centered men and silenced women, could not ignore her. Her name was written, not in scandal, but in lineage. When the sacred genealogy of kings was recorded, when the bloodline leading to the Messiah was traced, Bathsheba's name did not vanish. It remained, not as a footnote, but as a hinge upon which history turned. And it was not simply that she bore Solomon. It was that she shaped him, raised him, counseled him, positioned him. Her motherhood was not merely biological, it was political, spiritual, national. She lived to see the kingdom at peace, a rare era of stability, built not by swords, but by wisdom. She saw her son honored not just for his power, but for his mind. And though Solomon would one day falter, as all men do, she knew that his reign began with clarity, with strength, with a story rooted in pain that had been transmuted into purpose. That story was hers, but even in peace, Bathsheba never forgot the cost. She remembered the night she was summoned without choice. She remembered the silence of her first pregnancy. She remembered the look on David's face when her husband's death was reported. She remembered the child she held only for a short while. These memories did not fade. They forged her. They kept her honest. They kept her strong. They reminded her that power, when gained without justice, will always demand a reckoning, and that women like her, who were never given power but took it in the spaces between words, were the ones who changed history without anyone noticing it till it was too late.